Hello. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Ramesh Balsekar, a spiritual master, a sage, one who has realized his true nature and never forgets it. Ramesh was educated in India and then in England, and after that pursued a career as a banker for 30 years. After he retired, about a year later, he met his true guru, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and it was not too long after that that Ramesh received enlightenment. Hello, Ramesh.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you. And your teacher, Nisargadatta Maharaj, dealt with advaita. What is advaita?
Advaita really means absence of duality. Dvaita is duality. And Advaita means non-duality, or more accurately, absence of duality. It means, in effect, an unbroken wholeness.
Is Advaita a religion?
Advaita is not a religion. Advaita is the basic principle of most organized religions. But as the religions proliferated into various interpretations, this basic principle of the transcendent philosophy, the perennial philosophy, that got lost, and the religions got involved in a lot of their individual interpretations. So this basic principle, the ground of all being, which is they call it the absolute or unmanifest, which itself manifests into this apparent universe. So the basic principle is that it is the universal principle which manifests itself, and the science, modern science, calls it a self-generated process. So this manifestation of the universe, which the mystic has always said has been a process which has happened by itself, the scientist now confirms that it is a self-generated process. No one brings it about, it has just happened.
Well, what's all the fuss about? I mean, people are seeking enlightenment, people feel like they're in bondage. How does all that come about then?
That came about because the individual started thinking of himself in terms of an individual. Actually, what is an individual? The individual is really nothing but an object. The object precisely like any other object. But an inanimate object has neither life nor sentience. The animal, a sentient being, has sentience. So what distinguishes a sentient being from an inanimate object is the existence of sentience, which enables the senses to work. And the human being is a sentient being with the additional gift of intellect. So the inanimate objects plus sentience is the animal, and the animal with intellect is the human being. And the human being, because of his intellect, has separated himself from the universe and has considered himself a separate individual, a separate entity. And the very fact of his considering himself a separate entity, this very separation is the bondage. So now he has created the bondage, he has created the intellect, has created a concept of bondage, and with the concept of bondage, the concept of liberation comes in. So if the individual does not consider himself in bondage, the question of liberation just doesn't come in.
Does the individual concoct this idea of bondage, or is it somehow built into life, the misconception that we're in bondage?
The misconception that we are in bondage is because of the very concept of a separate individual. Actually, he is just an object. But it is this intellect which has separated him from the rest of the universe. And instead of being merely an object and realizing that it's only an object, an instrument through which totality or God functions, he assumes that he is a subject. The real subject can only be one. All are objects. But he has, the individual human being has usurped the subjectivity of God, or call it the subjectivity. And with this usurpation of subjectivity, he has separated himself. And it is this separation which itself which leads him to all kinds of feelings of misery. The individual thinks he is in misery, and therefore he wants release from this misery, which he calls freedom. So this, he calls his misery, individual misery, as bondage, and wants to save himself from that bondage. So he is seeking means outside to get himself what he thinks liberated. But it is his own separation from the universe as a separate entity, and the real liberation comes with the realization that he cannot be a separate entity, that he is just a part of the unbroken wholeness which is the universe.
So let me see if I understand now. The universe is one, a totality, an unbroken wholeness.
Yes.
And somehow, though, this idea of an individual comes about. How does that work, that the individual comes into this wholeness?
All there is really, this absolute, all there is consciousness. The individual comes in only when there is awareness. There is no individual in deep sleep. It is only when he is awake. That means when there is a sense of presence, when there is this sense of being aware of oneself. And in that awareness, the basic awareness, for instance, when any individual wakes up from sleep, from deep sleep, the first consciousness, the first awareness is not that awareness of an individual. The first awareness is of the impersonal consciousness. So when the impersonal consciousness identifies itself with each individual body-mind organism as an individual, that the me comes up. So basically it is the impersonal consciousness identifies itself with an object, and the me arises.
So the impersonal consciousness brings about this individual then?
Through identification with each individual organism. That is correct.
In itself there is no individual.
Individual is a concept.
It's a concept brought about by the impersonal consciousness.
Which has identified itself as an individual.
Oh.
So the whole point is that the impersonal consciousness has identified itself with the individual body-mind organism as an individual. And this identification continues through several body-mind organisms. And in a certain body-mind organism, the mind turns inwards. And then the process of disidentification starts. And the end of this process of disidentification is what is termed as enlightenment. So it is the whole process of identification and disidentification is an impersonal process in which the individual is merely an organism through which this impersonal process happens. So the very idea of an individual entity becoming enlightened is fallacious. That is the basic fallacy. And the ultimate enlightenment happens when this basic fallacy is realized, that it is a fallacy. So the realization of the fallacy of the individual is enlightenment, which in other words means a disidentification from the individual organism and an identification with the unbroken wholeness.
Well, then impersonal consciousness gives up its identification and realizes its own true nature.
Its own true nature. That is so the whole process is impersonal.
So the individual is a play character. It comes into being, it goes out of being.
Yes. It is a character in this play that is life and living.
Now, from the viewpoint of the individual, though, as an identified individual,
Yes.
Even if it is impersonal consciousness, that's not the ordinary thinking. Individual has an identity, a me. For instance, I'm sitting here talking with you.
Yes.
It would appear that I'm an individual talking
Yes,
with you.
but then what has turned you into a seeker? You are an individual talking to me as a seeker.
Yes.
So what are you seeking?
Well, I'm seeking.
So who wants to know what?
Yeah.
Who is seeking what? So the whole point therefore is that impersonal consciousness at a certain point in a certain body-mind organism has created a thought in the brain of that individual organism which leads that organism to find out his true nature. So that is how the seeking has begun. So it is not that Rivka is seeking anything. The impersonal consciousness is seeking its own source through a body-mind organism which is called Rivka.
Yet, on the other hand, you were saying that there is no separation in this impersonal consciousness. It's a one totality of consciousness.
It's one totality.
So, in that sense, then
This one totality, that is the consciousness at rest, in which consciousness is not aware of itself. The moment the sense of awareness, I am, arose in that consciousness at rest, the consciousness became aware of itself. And awareness means a duality. To be aware, you have to be aware of something. So in that unbroken wholeness, the consciousness in its state of rest, in its original state of rest, there was no need for it to be aware of itself. So when this sense of I am arose in that state of consciousness at rest, which the scientist calls the Big Bang, then this awareness arose, and the awareness, with that awareness came this duality. And with that awareness came this manifestation. And the manifestation, once it arises, the existence of the manifestation depends on its being observed. And for its being observed, the manifestation needs space in which the manifestation, the three-dimensional object, can be extended, and time in which that three-dimensional object can be observed. So all that is really happening is that once the manifestation has come into being, observing is taking place, and for observing to take place, the observing takes place through individual body-mind organisms. So each individual organism is an object through which the impersonal consciousness observes its own manifestation.
now so far in this story, there's identification or not? Is the me necessary for this observing to take place?
No. The me comes in only after the basic duality of the observing taking place through an observer object and the observed object. For the observing to take place, there has to be an observer object and the observed object. When the observer object assumes this subjectivity, then this dualism comes into being. Otherwise, they are both observer object and observed object.
And the true subject is this totality
That
of
is
consciousness,
correct.
impersonal.
So the only subject is totality of God observing through the individual organism. But once the observer object assumes subjectivity, then the me and the other comes in. So for the observer object becomes the observer subject. And the rest of, and by that means he separates himself from the rest of the universe as his object.
And that's how this so-called real world, the world that most people think of as real,
and
comes
therefore,
into
with
being.
this individual separation, this interhuman relationships come in, and life and living as we know have come in. But once this realization happens, that the observer subject is really only an object. That is what the ultimate enlightenment means. So the ultimate enlightenment merely means a reversal of the process which has happened from duality to dualism. So the reversal from the dualism to duality, when the observer object realizes that he cannot be a subject, that the only subject is totality of God, and that he is only an object through which observing takes place, then the usurpation of the original usurpation of this subjectivity is given up. And the observer object no longer considers himself as a subject, but that he is merely an observed object like anybody else, and that he is an instrument through which the observing happens, and he is merely an instrument through which totality of God functions and brings about such actions as are considered necessary.
So at some point, this identification comes about,
Yes.
and this separation happens.
Yes.
Does this identification come about spontaneously?
It does.
So there's an object, and then all of a sudden it's an identified. It thinks it's a subject. It's an
Yes.
object that now has some
Assumed subjectivity.
subjectivity,
And with
some-
that, the me has come into being.
And that's what our lives are usually all about.
That is correct.
Seems like from the time we start to identify ourselves as children,
Yes.
as a separate being.
Entities, yes.
And in fact, as we grow up, we get that identity more and more strongly.
That's correct.
It seems like it's a natural part of life,
Yes.
and our growing up to become identified. And then, as you said, some of us, somehow that idea of seeking also comes about
That is
spontaneously.
yes.
Why does it happen in some objects and not in other objects?
Why should it not? It's part of the process. It's part of the evolution. Evolution which goes on from first the consciousness identifying itself. The process of identification continues through several body-mind organisms, through several lives. And in a particular organism, when the thought occurs or some event occurs which turns the mind inwards, the process of disidentification starts.
You've mentioned twice now there's several lives, and as I understand it, there is no real me. So what is this the concept of reincarnation? And what is it that would reincarnate?
Nothing is reincarnated. New lives are created, new body-mind organisms are created, so that this process of evolution will go on.
Impersonal.
The impersonal, the whole process is impersonal. But for this evolution to go on, new lives, certain actions are created, those actions have effects. So this causality is the basis of the functioning of the universe. So for certain actions to happen, new body-mind organisms are created in new generations so that fresh actions will take place. And this, so action and effect, the effect becomes the cause, and this is how all life and living is all about. It's based on causality.
Well, then somehow there's some train of cause and effect passing through various births.
The cause and effect relates only to actions and not to the individual. And it is in the functioning of totality that actions happen. And the organisms, the various body-mind organisms, are there merely for the actions to take place.
Okay, so in one of these,
yes,
it seems to spontaneously come about
yes.
that a supposed individual
yes.
gets the idea of seeking
of wanting to know what this is all about. So the individual wants to know what his true nature is. That is what the seeking is all about. And the seeking really, as I said, at the basis of it is the impersonal functioning of totality. The impersonal consciousness identifies itself, and the identification continues for several births, and when the mind turns inwards, the process of disidentification starts, and that goes through several body-mind organisms, through several lives, but the lives are different organisms. They do not refer to the evolution of any single entity. There is no such thing as an entity. So the process goes on through different objects. So the process goes on, and for the process to go on, new body-mind organisms are created. It is not that any entity takes on new forms in order to evolve.
Then there would really be an entity, a me existing.
That is correct. And so this karma is causality. So causality is the very basis of life and living.
Which is an impersonal event.
Which is an impersonal functioning of totality.
It seems rather strange, then, that some of these objects in this story should begin to be seekers and seek release from the story.
Yes.
But it does happen, and they find their way sometimes to gurus like yourself or teachers.
Yes.
It's hard to get away from the idea that there's an individual who's fated to go somewhere, and that it's simply an impersonal story. It's hard to, of course, that's probably built in, that it's hard to understand that.
That is correct, yes.
But what is it that brings a disciple together with his guru?
The disciple and the guru are part of this process of the impersonal consciousness seeking, first identifying itself and then seeking its own source.
Part of that impersonal.
It is, both are the interrelated concepts of that process.
Now, some of these identified individuals never entertain this process. They go about their lives being born, growing up, dying, without ever thinking about enlightenment.
Because those organisms then are still a part of the process of identification. And in that evolutionary process of identification still going on, the question of seeking doesn't arise. So it is only after this mind has turned inwards that the process of disidentification or the process of seeking has started.
Now, all that you're telling about right now seems to be from the perspective of the individual going through this process.
No, on the contrary.
No.
As I've told you, the whole process is an impersonal process, and the individual organism is merely an object through which this process is happening. So the basis is really not the individual. The individual comes into trouble, thinks he's unhappy, and he's an unhappy seeker because he thinks in terms of an individual wanting enlightenment as an object. So part of the understanding, part of this growing up spiritually is to realize that the individual is really basically only an object, and no object can become enlightened. Basically, the sentient being, the human being, is basically still an object. So what he really is, his true nature, is only consciousness. So the very first glimmer of understanding arises when he realizes that he cannot be an object, that which works through an object must be something other than the object. So that begins the seeking for that which functions through the organism.
Is this the sense of I am, sense of consciousness that the seeker begins to get a glimpse of?
Yes. the seeker begins to get a glimpse that his sense of presence, this consciousness, in deep sleep he is not aware of anything. So it is only when he is conscious, when he wakes up and becomes conscious, only in that awareness does this question come up.
Only when he's awake.
Only when he is awake. So what is really present?
Consciousness.
It is consciousness, which is the sense of presence.
Yeah. But
And
within,
the sense of presence is present in the waking state, and the sense of presence as a me is absent in deep sleep state. So this alternating presence and absence of the sense of presence is the very basis of existence. Existence is based on duality that is interconnected opposites. Everything is moving, everything is changing, and this change is based on opposites. But the human individual thinks those opposites are separate and that he can compare and choose between. So he wants to be good to the exclusion of bad. He wants only beauty to the exclusion of all ugliness. But the beauty and the ugliness, the good and the evil are interrelated objects, are interrelated concepts, and one cannot exist without the other.
So this me thinks in terms of opposites, though he believes that one part of the opposite is true. He cannot hold on to both opposites at the same time.
And if he's conscious of both, then his unhappiness won't be there. The basis of his unhappiness is his wanting one as opposed to the other. He's wanting one thing, and he's not realizing that the one cannot exist without the other. And this seeing both together does not happen normally, because the human perception is based on the fact that it can only see in a limited way. It cannot see the whole picture. And that this indeterminacy of not seeing both opposites at the same time can be seen in this paradoxical cube.
How does that work?
In this paradoxical cube, when you see it as a cube, you watch it as a cube.
It seems to flip. First you're looking down on it, and then you're looking up at the
So the face of the cube keeps on changing, shifting. But the camera doesn't change. I mean, the camera sees the cube continuously as a cube. It is only when you see it, camera doesn't see it as a cube. The camera sees it only as a figure. So only when you, because of the intellect, sees the cube as a cube and not merely as a figure of certain lines and a combination of lines, then you see it as a cube, and therefore this flip-flop happens, you see.
I want to understand what the form is. I want to give it a name.
So once you give it a form as an object, then it changes. But if you see it as part of the totality, then you see the totality as based on interconnected opposites.
And this would be impersonal.
And this would be the impersonal seeing.
But it's not the case for the me. The me is either going to see it one way or the other way.
That is correct, you see. And you see, once you see that this flip-flop occurs only because you see it as a cube and not as in its original general basis. So when you see the universe as totality, then your unhappiness doesn't happen, because then you don't keep choosing. So enlightenment is merely the understanding that this universe is an unbroken whole, and that the opposites are interconnected, and that the change is the very basis of life and living. Therefore nothing can be constant. So what the human being is unhappy about is that he keeps chasing security. And what this understanding is all about is that there can be no security, because life is based on opposites, and whatever exists now is bound to change.
Life is a flip-flop.
Life itself is a flip-flop. Understanding that brings about a sense of quietude, a sense of peace.
Now, this brings up another thought. I've heard you say about enlightenment that there's a transformation in the perceivings. Somehow
Yes.
that
You see-
what was unreal.
Yes, actually, how did this enlightenment first happen? With this process of identification, turning inwards, and the disidentification, at some point, the ultimate happening of enlightenment must have happened. So what does this real enlightenment mean, or what did it mean to those people who had this enlightenment, or in which body-mind organisms this happened? So this has been happening from time immemorial. This understanding, or this perennial philosophy, this sudden understanding or sudden realization of one's real nature has been happening in every part of the country from times immemorial. And what it really means is that there is a sudden intuitive insight whereby there is a radical revision, a radical vision of transcendence. And this radical vision of transcendence, what it really means is that in that vision of transcendence, the reality gets transported into a totally different dimension. That is a real flip-flop, and it is a permanent understanding. And that understanding becomes that the reality as we see it, as is perceptible to the senses, is not the true reality. And that there is an experience, an actual experience, that the real reality is the unreal. What seems to us unreal now is experienced as reality. And what appears to us as reality to our senses is really only an appearance. So this sudden vision of transcendence has been happening from times immemorial.
So this event, which is enlightenment, which is called enlightenment, it sounds like a change in two dramatic ways, at least. And one is that a true flip-flop of perception that you were describing.
No, it's no longer a flip-flop. The flip-flop ceases. The flip-flop existed because the unbroken wholeness was not realized. So the basis of this understanding, or this basis of this radical vision of transcendence, is that the individual really has no free will. That all that is happening is an impersonal happening. And that the individual who had so far considered himself as an individual entity is really not an individual entity at all, but merely an object or an instrument through which totality functions. So the basic essential difference is that the sense of personal entity, the sense of personal doership, the sense of having a personal free will drops off. That is the basic thing. And what the average person finds it extremely difficult to give up is a sense of free will. So the sense of free will, or the sense of personal doership, has to drop off. And the dropping off permanently of that, not merely an intellectual understanding, But the maximum possible total conviction that he really is not an individual entity, but merely an organism through which the totality functions, means a surrender of his free will. And if there is no free will, obviously there is no individual doer. So when enlightenment happens, all that really drops off is this sense of personal identity, the sense of personal doership, and not anything else. So the identification with a body-mind organism must continue. Because the body-mind organism to function has to have identification. So whether it is Jesus Christ or Buddha or Ramana Maharshi or anybody, any sage, when he is accosted, he would respond. That means the identification with the body-mind organism still continues.
But yet there's somehow some intuitive knowledge that that identification is an accident of...
No. The identification with the body-mind continues. So this sudden radical vision of transcendence is the transcendence from identity with an individual to an identity with the unbroken wholeness. So what happens is the individual identification drops off, which is in effect automatically an identification with the unbroken wholeness.
But yet they're still functioning through that individual.
The functioning of the body-mind organism continues without a sense of personal doership. And that what works through the body-mind organism is a working mind. So what drops off is the thinking mind, which is the sense of personal doership. And it is the thinking mind which considers itself the doer.
And the me.
And the me. The thinking mind is the me. Me as the doer. Now, when the body-mind organism continues to function with the sense of identification, the sage continues to say me and mine. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to function in this. But he says me and mine with the deepest possible understanding that this me and mine refers only to the body-mind organism. That there is truly no owner of that body. The conviction is that I am not the body and the body is not mine. Therefore, in other words, the identification thereafter is with that unbroken wholeness. And this, when this first radical understanding happened, these people knew that it was something which could not be easily passed on to others. It had to happen. So they didn't bother to become religious leaders. They wouldn't have been accepted anyway, because the whole basis of their teaching would have been, as it is now, that there is really no individual. So what they did was just continue in their lives as if nothing had happened. And they found that certain people, by some mysterious force, were directed to them. And these were the people on the threshold of this understanding and needed the help of these newly enlightened beings to point them the way. And this is how the guru-disciple relationship first came into being. Those who were guided by the original enlightened people themselves became enlightened. And this process of the mysterious force leading other people to these people, that continued.
Now this mysterious force, this is what is generally called grace?
Yes.
But what is it?
All there is consciousness. So whatever label you give it, you call it grace or you call it something else, call it compassion, you call it love, you call it God, it is still the same basis, this original ground of all being, which is consciousness. You can call it God, you can call it awareness. but the name is not of the essence.
Is it the same power that brings about any of these, that brings about identification in the first place?
That is correct.
Turning inward to become a seeker and
Yes,
enlightenment.
that is correct. So it is the same power, identifies itself first, and leads several organisms through this identification. Then the mind turns inwards, and the process of disidentification or the seeking begins. And all this is directed. Now this process of evolution.
Yeah.
Who directs it? The individual is merely an instrument. So it is the same mysterious force, call it consciousness, which directs this evolutionary process and brings about this guru-disciple relationship.
Now, I understand you're saying that this is all very impersonal, and yet my understanding of this guru-disciple relationship is that there's a lot of love in it. It's a very personal relationship in some sense.
Yes, that is part of this relationship. And therefore, ultimately, the true guru understands that the final obstruction for the disciple is to get over this affection or attachment for the guru. In other words, the understanding, the acceptance of the impersonality becomes total only when this relationship of duality between the guru and the disciple itself gets bridged. Bridged. In other words, only when the disciple and the guru become merged. Actually, the guru and the disciple do get merged. When the disciple, there is enlightenment happens in the disciple. But in this phenomenality, so long as the disciple continues as an individual body-mind organism, this special respect and reverence for the guru still continues, even with the understanding that apart from consciousness, there is nothing else.
So this merging that takes place is this realization, or the dropping off of the me. It's this.
That is correct.
It's a realization that there isn't, and there wasn't ever any separation.
There never was any me at all. That is the ultimate understanding.
Let's talk a little bit more about, once enlightenment has taken place, this working mind, this thinking mind. If I understand correctly, then the thinking mind, or the me, is the one that gets involved. It's the one that flip-flops back and forth. And,
yes.
And this...
So once the thinking mind is absent, what it really means is that the working mind, the body-mind organism, is no longer troubled by any sense of worries, of consequences. So what really happens then is that all the actions which take place through the body-mind organism are merely witnessed as impersonal actions, as part of the functioning of totality, and not my actions.
But yet, I've also been led to understand that the enlightened, where enlightenment has taken place, that there's joy. It's not some kind of impersonal witnessing where there's no happiness or no enjoyment.
Yes. Now, Rivka, we are talking about what happens in daily life.
Yes.
After enlightenment has taken place. How does the body-mind organism function?
Yes. Right.
The body-mind organism functions, and the actions which take place through that body-mind organism are witnessed not as his actions, but as part of the functioning of totality. And the concomitant understanding is really not concomitant, it's the same understanding, that just as the actions which take place through this body-mind organism are not my actions, there is the understanding that the actions which take place through some other body-mind organism are not his or her actions. So if at any time the actions which take place through another body-mind organism are not relatively beneficial for this organism, then with that understanding, the other person, no longer a person, is no longer considered as an enemy. So that is the biggest biggest result of this understanding in life. And so this love which arises the love is the result of this understanding, that there is no entity as himself as the doer, nor is there any entity as the other. So when the me drops off, together with the me, the other too drops off. And when the me and the other both drop off, all that remains is love and compassion. So it is love and compassion are not something which you as an individual can do, but love and compassion are the natural result of this understanding that there is neither a me nor another.
You know, here's what strikes me as strange, and no doubt it's this human intellect which can only comprehend flip-flops, but it sounds wonderfully personal in a way, this compassion, what is this impersonal love, this impersonal compassion sounds so alive. The sense of impersonal is...
You see, this love which we are talking about, for one person for the other, is based on its interconnected opposite of hate.
Yeah.
So love and hate are the phenomenal interconnected opposites, which one entity bears towards another entity.
But this is not
what you're talking about. This is not so.
Yeah.
This is, in fact, what I'm talking about is totally different. It's an entirely different dimension. Therefore, this love and compassion, which is impersonal love and compassion, which arises merely or simply because this separation between me and the other has dropped. So this, what remains, is the love and compassion, which is the very basis of the understanding.
It's almost like a natural state.
It is a natural state. It is not all. It is a natural state.
Yeah.
See? It is the natural state.
What about death, Ramesh? What happens where enlightenment has taken place? How is death viewed?
You see, viewed is right. Actually, there is no difference. A body-mind organism, when it dies, it dies. And at the moment of death, where the body-mind organism is dead, it makes no difference whether the body-mind was one in which enlightenment had happened, or it is a body-mind organism in which enlightenment has not happened. It is still an object made of the 5 elements. So the body-mind object gets destroyed. So any object that is created is destroyed. Any object which has been integrated gets disintegrated. So what really dies is only that which has been born, and that is an object.
This impersonal consciousness then was never born.
Impersonal consciousness was never born. Impersonal consciousness is all there is.
Within which objects...
Within which all this manifestation has arisen.
So these objects born and dying and born and dying
is
happens...
part of that appearance.
Within impersonal consciousness. So then life, death, it's just...
are merely events.
Events.
In this functioning of totality. Actually we talk of death.
Yeah.
But in our body-mind organism now, deaths are creating, births and deaths are happening continuously, now, this moment. This body is composed of cells. And the cells in this body, in any organism, get created and destroyed every split second. So from the point of view of the cell, birth and death is happening almost simultaneously. So because we have a longer time comparatively, relatively longer time, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, 100 years, therefore when the me thinks in terms of death, the me can understand that the body will die, but the me does not want to die with the body. So with this understanding, the me is already dead.
How so?
The me as the doer,
with this, yes.
with enlightenment,
Yes. Yeah.
with the event called enlightenment, the me no longer exists.
Yes.
So if the me no longer exists, there is no me to be afraid of death. But where enlightenment has not happened, in the case of an ordinary person, the me is afraid.
So there being no me, no fear of death happens.
That is correct. You mean after enlightenment?
Yes. So how is death viewed? I mean, at that point, the vehicle for consciousness would be disintegrating.
That is correct.
There would be no longer consciousness as is recognized in as our
But
life.
you see now, in other words, your question is what happens after the death of the body
Yes.
to consciousness.
Yes.
Now, if you tell me what happens to electricity when one electrical gadget goes out of order, same thing happens to consciousness. Electricity continues to function through other gadgets,
I see.
existing and new ones to be created.
So the
So consciousness continues to function through existing body-mind organisms and new ones to be created.
The question then comes from the intellect.
The question comes
Right.
from the intellect, from the thinking mind, from the me,
Who is afraid of
who is afraid
passing away.
of passing away, doesn't want to do
Yeah.
that. Therefore, this morbid question. All right, I understand the body will die, but what happens to me?
Yeah.
And it is satisfied to a certain extent when the me is told, just to satisfy the child, then the me gets incorporated in some other body-mind organism. But there is no me, and this the Buddha has made very clear. He said there is no soul to be transmigrated. There are only deeds and no doer thereof. And it's rather almost not only astonishing, it's almost comical that the basis of Buddhism and Hinduism should be reincarnation of an individual soul but there it is. You see. That is precisely how the interpretations and the way the religions, organized religions, are interpreted.
Come about.
That this differences come about.
Once you told the story of I believe the Buddha talking to someone, and the analogy went to the crying baby. Could you share that, because it seems pertinent here that
yes, that is. He says the Buddha is supposed to have told one disciple. See, he said, "Is there a mind?" So he said, "The mind, the reality is the mind, or the mind is the reality." And the next day, this disciple found that he said, "The reality is no mind." The Buddha said, "Reality is no mind is reality." So when he asked the master what had happened, how could it be? So he said, when the child is crying, so he is told that the mind is reality. It's a concept to chew on. But when the child stops crying, he is told that there is no mind. In other words, what it means is that reality is still a concept.
yes,
So the classic simile in Buddhism is that you give a child golden leaves and tell him that is gold. But when the child achieves a certain amount of maturity, he knows that they are only leaves, they are only golden leaves.
So it seems that Advaita, or perennial philosophy, doesn't need reincarnation. Those are like golden leaves, or
That is correct.
for a crying child.
They are golden leaves for a crying child.
Advaita is mature.
Advaita is not mature. Advaita is the original ground of all existence. It is the absolute subject, the unmanifest subject, and the unmanifest and the manifest. The subject and this objective representation are not two. That is why this unbroken wholeness.
Yes.
Consciousness at rest itself becomes consciousness in manifestation. So the subject itself becomes the objective expression. The absolute becomes the relative. The unmanifest becomes the manifest. So there never have been any two entities. There always has been an unbroken wholeness, one unicity.
And that never changes.
That never changes. That is the only thing which doesn't change, because it is not in phenomenality. Everything in phenomenality is based on change.
All right, Ramesh, thank you very, very much. I've enjoyed this very much.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you.